I'm Jane Garrity. Thank you for being here. This is the prologue to my memoir. My memoir is all about my spiritual awakening, healing my childhood trauma wounds, my abuse and my marriage wounds, PTSD, and alcohol addiction. Once I hit menopause, my life had to change. I couldn't do it anymore. So thank you for being here and thank you for listening. I encourage you to hit subscribe because my story is going to get real good. I found myself standing in tall grass on a high mountainside. It's green and lush, and there were gray rocks jutting out in wild places. I had no idea where I was. Out of nowhere, he swooped in. He had huge wings with tight feathers that were intricately woven and the brightest white I've ever seen in my life. Was this real? I thought. He had long, wavy hair and big blue eyes, and he smiled at me. He stood right in front of me, and I lowered my head. For some reason, I felt ashamed. He held up my chin, and he looked me right in the eye, and he wrapped his wings around me in what felt like an energetic hug, and it covered me like a tarp, and I was encased within it. He put his other hand on my chest, and he said, "You will find yourself again." And then, just as fast as he swooped in, I watched him fly away. When I opened my eyes, I was sitting on the hard plastic chair in my aesthetics class in a circle with other young women. I felt a sense of wonder, confusion, and the need to move as sweat dripped down my back, and I knew that I would have to peel myself off that chair. Our aesthetics instructor had a guest that day to teach us about energy and Reiki, and she brought us all on a shamanic journey. One woman said she saw a raven and was given a message. Another woman said she traveled to a place she had never seen or been to before. And me? Well, I met an archangel. In late 2007, I quit my first corporate job to homeschool my middle school age children. And then I also went back to school again to change careers. I had been inspired by the spa industry and decided that I wanted to learn about skin chemistry and professional makeup artistry and was ready to restart a career in a completely different direction from the one I had started back in 2001. I had spent the previous 6 years working in a career I thought I wanted and one that I fought to get. But it wasn't at all how I thought it was going to be. Earlier that year was the first time I gathered the courage to tell my husband of 14 years that I wanted a divorce. Of course, it didn't go over well, and I got the "you're never happy" and the heated backlash that seemed to come with all of my wishy-washiness around finding fulfillment for myself. The truth was that I had wanted a divorce before I even got married, but I always stayed. I thought that marriage and relationships meant forever and that all of the hard times and good. And so that's what I did. I also stayed out of ego. I wasn't willing to fail because I knew that's what my family was expecting. If my mother said jump, I sat down. If she said stop stealing my cigarettes, I'd steal more. My teenage years were about defying my mother, smoking and skateboarding in the arroyos of Albuquerque, and not about what I wanted to be when I grew up. All of these thoughts would run through my mind on any given day, but they would especially ruminate after one of the many fights with my husband. If I left them, how would that look? What would happen to the kids? The kids need both parents together, or they would end up broken and damaged. Am I broken and damaged? My parents are divorced. What would my parents think? How many times in my life so far have I disappointed my parents? This is just me wanting to rebel again. I would be marked with a big D. I'd just be a statistic. The reality, though, was my choices were either to be a single mom in poverty or staying in a toxic marriage so that we could live in a house with a yard and have food on the table. That is what I chose for my kids. I would come to realize later that when I chose toxicity for myself, I chose toxicity for them too. So as I sat with my sweaty ass on that hard plastic chair, wondering what had just happened, I cried. I had thought about my short career in corporate, which I had ended early, but I also had to remember why I left. I had started as a customer service rep, then as an assistant product manager, then as an associate, then promoted to a full-fledged product manager. In those 6 years, my computer programming skills and what I learned in higher education had a profound impact on who I was and how I worked. I worked directly with software engineers and assisted in debugging and troubleshooting code for our homemade software. I would become the person who trained new hires during orientation on our products, our industries, and why we did what we did was important for research and drug discovery. As I continued to move up that corporate ladder, I would also endure. Endure as all women do with sexism and white man privilege. A core memory that stays in my archives is when I was sitting in a meeting room at a table with all men. This was a go, no-go meeting with engineering, production, marketing, quality, and executives with regards to holding the launch date of our new automated product or to let it go. I was the only woman in the room. I was wearing black pants, a black blazer with a pink button-down shirt. My power suit. I felt powerful wearing it. I felt like I belonged there. I earned that seat at that table. Sitting next to me was the head of R&D, an older, silver-haired man that had been with the company since the beginning. As we were all going through checking the boxes and discussing next steps, he turned to me casually and asked, "Hey, Jane, I was reading an article the other day about how women's brains are smaller than men's. I'd like to know your thoughts on that." What? I didn't even have a chance to comprehend what he was asking. As for one, it was completely out of context, so I was blindsided. And two, I didn't think he was being curious. It felt that he was trying to be intimidating, which was working. Within seconds, without me even having a chance to process it, let alone respond, one of the other engineers said, "Wait, what? Present company excluded. Let's move on." Thank God I don't have to speak. I'm saved. But he didn't stop. He went on. "Really, though, I'm curious to know your opinion on the matter, Jane. What do you think about women's brains being smaller than a man's?" I had no idea what he was talking about. I felt my face become hot, so I knew it was red, along with my chest and my insides. I was hot from the inside out. Should I say something back? What do I say? What a prick. Then my boss said whatever it was that he said to get the meeting moving along. Another save. Phew. You know, when we're in a situation and we feel paralyzed over whatever is happening or being said, and we just move on, and then afterwards our minds go into overdrive thinking of all of the possible responses that we didn't get to say? That's what I was ruminating on. All of the things I wish I could have said. Later that same afternoon, that man happened to be standing in my boss's office while I was putting a folder on the desk. And he asked me again. Now, he could have just been completely curious as to my true opinion as I stood there in my power suit. But again, it felt intimidating. This time, I was ready. I stood my 5'4" petite frame in front of his 6'5" tall, broad body and his old man silver hair. And I looked at him up in the eye. And I said, "The only reason you feel the need to ask me such things is because you're obviously trying to overcompensate for your own shortcomings." And then I walked away. I was shaking. Even though I felt prepared with my response, after going over it in my head, I had never expected the opportunity to actually say it to his face. I had an adrenaline surge. I felt my face getting red again, and I sat down in my cube. And I smiled. The struggle of being a working mother is real. The constant worry about home while I was at work and the constant worry about work while I was at home. Did I remember to add money to the kids' lunch cards? I yelled at them too much this morning. Why can't they just get ready for school on time? We do it every day, for Christ's sakes. Why can't I control my emotions? My poor kids are suffering from the emotions of their own mother. They didn't eat enough breakfast. Will they be hungry before lunch? I don't want them to feel hunger pains. I hate my husband. Maybe if he was dead, it would be easier for us. Shit, I'm behind on this work project. Will they fire me? Why do I always think I'm going to be fired? Why do I continue to stay in a marriage that I don't want to be in? I was the one who took days off when they were sick or had doctor's appointments. It didn't matter that I made the same amount of money as my husband. His job was more important because he was considered the breadwinner. And don't get me started on the way women are treated within the workplace. I was miserable. Every day became a struggle. I would drop my kids to school and apologize and cry all the way to work. I was so sorry for ruining their day before it even started. How could I send them off to school after the morning we had? My husband wasn't much help. In his defense, he left for work at 4:30 a.m. But he would pick up the kids after school and they would all go home and play video games for 3 hours until I would get home at 6 to start cooking dinner. I began to buy those Betty Crocker boxed meals, the kind where all you have to do is add chicken and water and there's like a rice mixture and contents and you bake it. So I asked my husband to start stepping up to help out. He was home hours before me after all. He would call me at work and ask me how to do it. The instructions are on the fucking box. And I'd hang up. Why isn't he self-sufficient? Why can't he read the back of a fucking box? I would bum lorazepam tablets from one of my coworkers to help take the edge off. I was constantly pulled between being a mom and having a career. It was also me who spent Saturdays cleaning the house, walking the dog at both ends of the day, feeding the dog, coming home, making dinner, doing laundry, etc. So I was a mom, a product manager, a maid, a cook, a wife, the operations manager of the house, the accountant of the house, and the taxi driver, and everything I thought I was supposed to be, and I was miserable. Needless to say, I was not managing it well at all. I spoke with my gynecologist, and I was diagnosed with PMDD, premenstrual dysphoric disorder, and promptly filled a prescription for Prozac. Along with heart palpitations and panic attacks, I also suffered from debilitating migraines, which I was also on a prescription for. But it was when I started experiencing weird numbness in my body that my doctor had sent me to a neurologist because it seemed like I was having mini strokes. After an MRI showed that I was having an atrophic vein that led from my spine to my neck to my brain, that maybe that could be causing a reduction in blood flow to my brain, and maybe it was the cause of my migraines. It still didn't explain the numbness and blood clotting. I drove myself to the hospital one day after work because my left side was going numb. They couldn't find anything, so I drove myself home. At my next neurologist appointment, I had my mother come with me. I was given a prescription for blood thinners, and I just wasn't convinced that this was a true health problem. Oh, I felt it. I felt it in my body, but I still didn't believe it. By this time, I had been doing my own research, and I discovered that there were cases of a medication-induced lupus, and it included all of the symptoms that I was having. We asked this question to the neurologist. I didn't want to be on blood thinners at 34 years old. He said there was no way to tell if it was the medication, and that if I wanted to stop taking them, that I would be a non-compliant patient and that he wouldn't treat me. I looked at my mother and we said, okay, and we walked out. Once I stopped taking the Imitrex for migraines and the blood thinners, my symptoms disappeared. I stayed on the Prozac though. I loved it. I stopped having panic attacks and I stopped with the emotional outbursts. I actually felt little to no emotions at all. It was bliss. Before I would leave that company in late 2007, I would have co-written 2 technical product manuals, launched multiple products, trained hundreds of employees, visited high-value customers like the CDC, Pfizer, and NIH, delivering presentations and product training. I was on fire. I was good at what I did, and I was well-liked and well-respected. It was also during this time that I started dabbling with alcohol. I hadn't really drunk prior to this time frame, and when I would travel is when I would have a couple. just to take the edge off. Outside of experimenting in high school and being married to a Muslim, we'll get that into a later episode, there was no drinking allowed. My boss, my mentor, my ally would end up leaving the company after it was bought a couple of times over, and someone else took his place. The new guy that took over promptly hired a man to take my place and told me that I would now be an associate PM and that he thought I was promoted too soon and stripped me of my title. It took me 6 years to get there, and it was pulled out from under me in a 5-minute meeting. When I gave my notice, he took me out to lunch and had the audacity to apologize for treating me that way, and that he regretted his decision as the man he hired to take my place was good on paper, but in the long run, he wasn't the right fit. He didn't know how to execute. Having to hand over my hard work to him after he was hired and I was demoted left a bitter taste in my mouth. I felt bullied, beaten, and bruised. This would be the first time in my life, and not the last, that I took my 401k and went home. I couldn't believe that this is how they treated people in corporate and that this was considered normal. It's just business, nothing personal. Corporate culture was not for me. So at 36 years old, my kids were in the 6th and 8th grade and suffering in the throes of puberty, public school social stigmas, and not receiving the education I thought they would have in the small city, Manchester, New Hampshire. With class populations at an all-time high, 30 plus students per teacher, and my youngest suffering from ADHD and my oldest with an identity crisis, I felt I had only one option. Even though we both worked full-time, my husband and I didn't have enough income to send them to private school. After many weeks of arguing and debating, we made the decision to pull them out and that I would homeschool them. I begged him to let me quit my job and do it, and he finally acquiesced. As a full-time working mom to two children and one adult, I was fighting my own battles of exhaustion while maintaining a high performance at work and feeling the daily strain as it intertwined with motherhood. I hung a whiteboard in the dining room, and I became my children's teacher, and I their student. I learned how my youngest worked best when he could get up and move around. He would start an assignment, get up multiple times, and he would always complete his work, and with high scores. I learned that my oldest worked best in solitude, reading physics textbooks, learning history through books and movies, and having a bright philosophical mind. All of this I saw was being squashed in public school with too many kids, not enough teachers, and they were getting lost in the sea of conformity. I was happy to leave the corporate culture. I already knew that I was not cut out for working for the man. Man could go fuck himself. In the 6 years I worked for this biotech company, I had my fair share of sexism from leadership. I also built friendships that I still have today, 20 years later. So as my kids began getting comfortable with a new way of learning, I enrolled myself in aesthetic school. After seeing an archangel and hearing his words to me, "You will find yourself again," I felt hope for the first time in years. Hope that I would, in fact, find myself again. I also came to the instant realization that I was lost. It wasn't an easy time for our family. My oldest couldn't wait to be homeschooled while my youngest thought his life was going to be over. With me up and quitting my job, it left us with only one income, and we weren't sure how we would manage it. Outside of the new college loans I would take on, the fact was the day-to-day finances on one income meant that I needed to find a part-time job to make ends meet. This dabbling with alcohol while in corporate eventually ran over to my home life. As I was looking for part-time work, I had to find something for evenings and weekends so that it didn't disrupt my school time. By this time, my kids were taking online classes, so they didn't need me as much, so I ended up getting a job down the road as a cocktail waitress, and also not so silently pissed that I had to get a job in the first place. I felt angry that my family expected me to be the wife, the mother, the maid, the operations manager, the taxi, and I still had to fucking work. I felt that it was impossible to manage both, and I had built up resentment like a concrete wall, one cinder block at a time. I don't know what I expected it to be like, having never been a server before. However, I wasn't expecting that working 4 evenings a week including weekends as a server, would only yield at best, when it was busy, a measly $150 per week. I had drunk men smack my ass, rude old ladies expecting me to grovel at their feet, and while they looked me up and down. I did, however, have very easy access to booze. After not drinking for all of my adult life until now, I sure did slip very easily into it. I also had mastered the secret to free drinks. I would start a tab for a fake customer and drink at least 3 to 5 Bacardi and Diet Cokes during one shift. Sometimes I would pay for them out of my tips, and sometimes I didn't have the tips to cover it. So I would just wipe them out. I truly felt like it was the only way I could get through these shitty shifts at that club. I hated working there. I hated the middle-aged patrons who went there to get drunk. I hated the old white men who touched me and slurred their words. Watching the middle-aged women dressed to the nines beg, borrow, and steal for these same men's affections. I wanted to vomit. Drinking each evening while on the job, it was the only way for me to get through it. I ended up slipping into that very culture that I despised. This would be the first time I would abuse alcohol in my life, and certainly not the last. I would go home and beg my husband to let me quit, and I saw red every time he said, "No, we need that $150 for groceries." He wasn't wrong. We did need that money, but we weren't broke, and as I was the household accountant, I knew we didn't need to work. So I rebelled. I came home drunk most nights. I got out late, like at 1 to 2 a.m. late, and on weekends, I would stumble in and pass out in the bathroom while everyone else was asleep. My loneliness, depression, and anxiety trying to manage it all had found the glorious sweet nectar of alcohol to numb it. I did end up quitting that server job as I said, fuck it. I did get my husband on board, and at this point in my story, I was in a rebellious fuck them all stage. I partied hard. I would go out with friends from school, get blackout drunk, and then get up the next morning and do it all again the next day. I was out of control. I have learned over the years from looking back on my childhood and my first marriage and my jobs that if I felt like others were controlling me, I would rebel. I had no idea that I had the power within myself to change my situation. I was lost. That archangel was right. My conditioning and programming from childhood wouldn't allow me to stand on my own 2 feet. I had fear without courage. My abandonment wounds created a codependency to anything I could grab onto, especially men. When I got home from school that day, the day we had the psychic shaman visit, I needed to process what happened. I said to my husband, "This lady came to school today and we had some sort of meditation journey and I had an experience." "What? No way. I want to know what happened." We went into the bathroom and ran the water in the shower to talk so the kids couldn't hear. And I sat on the toilet and I told him what happened. He believed me. We cried and we hugged. I always wondered if he believed it because in some way he was hoping that I would find myself again. I had put him through hell and back about wanting a divorce the year prior. I pushed and pulled, and we all went through emotional turmoil. I was turning into an alcoholic, and I felt like my life was a huge mess. If this angel was right, then that meant there was hope. This concludes my first episode, the prologue. Thank you so much for joining. Thank you for listening. Please hit subscribe. You're not going to want to miss my next episodes. Please follow me on all my other social media accounts. I really appreciate you being here. Thank you.